I was walking along the railway line this morning thinking to myself, I don't have an opening gambit. I'm very bad at finding little jokes with which to begin. And I thought to myself, should I risk one of the previous principals' jokes, very bad jokes, John McDade's jokes. And I thought to myself, I don't think I'm going to sink quite that low. But as I walked along, I was reminded of a lecture. I won't call it a tour, but I was giving lectures in India. And I arrived hot and sticky from Delhi airport in the Jesuit community in North Delhi. And one of them asked me brightly, hello, Father, welcome. What are you going to talk about in your lectures? And of course, my mind was elsewhere totally. And I cheerfully said, I think I'm going to talk about the word we. And actually, that was what I was going to talk about. What it is that holds us together, what makes us, us, without setting us over against them. And as I walked up to Wimbledon Station, the phrase, the grammar of we. That's what I'm on about. If you think that's a totally useless gnomic utterance, means nothing, you're probably right. But that is why you need colleagues, which is why I'm going to miss a lot of my Heythrop colleagues, because when I come up with useless statements, they sort of look quizzical and say, what on earth do you mean by that? Have you read this, this, and this? And you go away and read it, and something begins to emerge. These are the Heythrop saints, and they're going to pepper my little talk to you. I've called this lecture a pilgrimage, and it's really a journey with Heythrop saints, the Heythrop legacy. It builds on themes which have already been mentioned in these few days, but which in good Jesuit pedagogical fashion bear a little bit of repetition. Indeed, it seems to me that pilgrimages are all about repetition, not creating a new path, a new track, a new way, but following where others have travelled. And that, when you think about it, is an enormous act of faith. We may not see the end of a path. We may not even get there, but we trust that the path has got value because it's built from out of the footprints of those who've gone before us. A path is just the traces of footprints. Brendan has already told the story of the college, and he's referred to the first Heythrop proper, the one familiar to the more elderly among us, the enormous classical pile in North Oxfordshire where the faculties of philosophy and theology were brought together in 1926. When the college moved into the University of London in 1970, those of us who made the transfer used to talk about life back on the ranch. It felt like that, a country retreat on the edge of the Cotswold outback, scruffy and unloved, with piles of old junk for furniture. When we left, it all had to be cleared, and I have an abiding memory of a great funeral pyre consuming the rubbish. Did it really burn non-stop for 40 days and 40 nights? It certainly felt like that. Brendan and I were part of the team that accompanied the library to London on E for Exodus Day. By strange chance, it was the day of the 1970 general election. In the morning, we cast our votes in the local village hall. I think it was the first election I took part in. And in the evening, we stood in Trafalgar Square as the results came in and Ted Heath became Prime Minister. Do you remember? It was an extraordinary change, another world. The swinging 60s were still crazily alive. The new college, in a building vacated by the Sisters of the Holy Child in Cavendish Square, stood on the sedate side of London's West End. It was everything the ranch wasn't. Neat, elegant, presided over by Epstein's magnificent bronze. I love that statue. no more than 15 minutes walk from the university area. In retrospect, the two worlds were not that far apart. In the wake of the Vatican Council, the old scholastic straitjacket in which the curriculum had been shackled for generations shifted to something more scripturally based and with greater attention to classical sources and indeed human experience. Philosophy and theology were integrated. The very first course I followed was given by Robert Murray on Revelation, a heady mixture of biblical theology and hermeneutics. 1967. I knew absolutely nothing. Still don't. I still think of that course that Robert gave us, the very best course on theology I ever had. A few days I received an email from one of those students describing the Heythrop of the late 1960s as a golden age. Well, that's an exaggeration. Some of the philosophy was pretty dire, and the endless distinctions necessary to make sense of the theme of grace in the medieval period were enough to make a 21-year-old like me lose the will to live. On the other hand, in that extraordinary year 1968, when students were taking to the barricades in Paris and protests against the Vietnam War were never ending, even in placid North Oxon, we were reading Heidegger and Sartre, Camus and Merleau-Ponty, publishing a subversive student union magazine. I was the art editor and I did the cartoons. Data protection probably means that these should not ever be published again, but anyway. Generally, we were plotting the overthrow of Western civilization as we knew it. Heythrop College Oxon, Heythrop College Oxford Circus morphed into each other. The best of post-Vatican II theology curriculum was fitted into the BD structure that we met in London. Interestingly, in London we studied more proper Aquinas than we ever did back on the ranch. We also read patristic texts for their own sake. Maurice Béverneau, name turned up earlier, great scholar of Cyprian, found himself teaching, I think for the first time, from his own invaluable edition of De Unitate Ecclesiae, and presiding over everything, like a benign great uncle, was one of the greatest of Catholic philosophers and the kindest of men, Freddie Copleston. Without his international reputation as an historian of philosophy, without the vision and organizing ability of Jack Mahoney, without the razor mind of Jerry Hughes, without the scriptural thoughts of John Ashton, without the pastoral common sense of Theo Davy, this amazing new enterprise would never have prospered as it did. And it almost didn't. By the end of the first decade, with the number of religious and seminarians going down and the number of laymen and women going up, it had quickly assumed the student profile that we know today. I can remember teaching at the Greg at that time, very much still, of course, a clerical centre, and I was smugly telling Jesuits there how different Heythrop College was. Lay people studying theology, personal tutorials, came the quizzical reply. But at Heythrop College in those days, not much attention was being paid to finance, and there were a few rocky moments to which Brendan has drawn our attention. It was one of the unsung Heythrop College saints, Edward Ennis, the then Jesuit treasurer, who sorted that out, because he was the one that established the Bellarmine Fund to provide the backing that we needed. At Cavendish Square, latterly here in Kensington Square, the new college turned itself from a Jesuit seminary into a centre of learning where clerical and lay students studied together, where scholars came to share their thinking in an atmosphere of freedom and lively debate. Michael Kerwin has referred to John Macquarie's celebratory lecture in honor of Karl Rahner. Great man was there in 1984, the year of his death. There was a regular series of Cardinal Heenan lectures on ecumenical relations. Some were fairly forgettable, but two stand out, from a very young Rowan Williams and a magisterial Ursula King, who's still here. Nicholas Lash was one of the first to receive an honorary doctorate, and luminaries like René Girard, Johann Baptist Metz, Charles Taylor contributed to conference in their honor. Frank Clooney from Harvard, Cambridge, Mass, and Sarah Coakley from Cambridge, the real one, of course, received honorary doctorates last year. Now, my original brainwave for this lecture was to knit together the best ideas and the most critical insights from these Heythrop saints into a seamless theological blanket, which would comfort us in the dark, Heythropless nights to come. Perhaps a brainstorm. Theology doesn't work like that. It's not the ideas as such which count. It's not even the Heythrop memories we've just looked at. It's what the ideas do in forming people and changing them in significant ways, making us, as Gwen was saying yesterday, more responsive, not just to what is given in a tradition of ancient wisdom, but also to what confronts us in the lived experience of following, of seeking to understand. I hope in what follows to offer some thoughts on that tension. My purpose is not to lament Heythrop's tragic demise, at least not too obviously. I may offer the odd grumpy aside. I want rather to reflect on Heythrop's undoubted achievement as a centre of serious teaching and learning in philosophy and theology. A few years ago, I gave a contribution to a conference we had here on comparative theology, close reading of texts from different religions over against each other. My good friend Martin Ganeri, now the Prior Provincial of the Dominicans, opened proceedings and focused his thoughts like a good Dominican around Aquinas. Now, for some reason, I started with Augustine. In so doing, I felt I had to justify myself, so I tried the jocular remark that Dominicans work within a single theological tradition, whereas Jesuits seem to take delight in beginning, well, anywhere. And I think there's something seriously important here. As Philip Endine was saying, Ignatian spirituality, that term, is a late 20th century phenomenon. Now, the spiritual exercises, 16th century, once the formative practice of a particular religious order, have now been recognized, and quite rightly, as a gift to the whole church. Indeed, when you think of what church means in Vatican II, a gift to the whole world. But that isn't to say that the exercises provide anybody with a theological program. Like any spiritual exercise, they invite us to take part in a journey, promising to those who are prepared to take the risk that we will discover something in this world of our everyday experience that speaks of nothing less than God's creative and redeeming action. Hence the title of my lecture. My own work over the years has tended to take its rise from places where people of different faiths meet and engage and face the world together. Persons of faith always relate to, they operate out of a very specific context, a place. And I work on the premise that such places can be read, just like written texts can be read. Places present themselves to the inquiring mind that sees beyond the prosaic and the purely functional and recognizes traces of the sacred in the buildings that we construct, in the artifacts with which we adorn those buildings, and above all in that moment of crossing a threshold into the unknown to enjoy a risky hospitality. In that sense, anywhere is much more than a place, but one example of a profound truth, Ignatius's insight that God is to be found in all things, in all things. If there is a Heythrop legacy, a Heythrop way of doing philosophy and theology, it lies with a particular pedagogy, a way of learning, or more exactly, a way of being taught by or becoming learned in God's Spirit. That's not to say that everyone learns and teaches the same thing or subscribes even to the same overarching method. On the contrary, a vast spectrum of schools and styles is opened up once this place, this moment, are taken with deep seriousness as the point of interaction between the best of human endeavour and whatever it is that we take to have transcendent value. Now, let me begin to elaborate that point with a very specific anywhere. Glasnevin Cemetery in North Dublin. There you will find the ugly granite monolith that marks the resting place of dozens of Jesuits from the Irish province. And among them is the poet laureate of this conference. He's there as P. Gerardus Hopkins, who died of typhoid in Dublin on the 8th of June 1889, aged just 44. Hopkins had a hard time in Ireland. We're given this picture of a lonely exile ground down by the drudgery of ministry and teaching. Yet his obituary in the Jesuit Journal of Record, our letters and notices, ends by recording his last words, spoken with his parents praying at his bedside. And he ends, "I am so happy, I am so happy." Happy that his misery was over, that he was released from this vale of tears. Some of his poems might give that impression, but what of the undoubted delight in the sheer beauty and majesty of things that pervades so much of his work? Any life, let alone that of a great genius like Hopkins, is not easily smoothed out into a pattern. Our point of view is always partial and places an important, perhaps life-giving limitation on our restless desire to understand, to get it all in order. The anonymous author of the obituary did not have the privilege of hindsight. He talks about Hopkins' abiding interest in music, in art, in literature and architecture, but he doesn't mention the word poetry. Without access to Hopkins' writing, hadn't been published. He simply tells the story as passed on to him in the form of comments and reminiscences from Hopkins' fellow Jesuits. Jesuit obituaries, and I know because I've written a few, do not overdo the compliments. This one is written with a palpable truthfulness, and I think a genuine affection. Hopkins not only had a touch of genius, says the writer, he was possessed of great guilelessness and simplicity, and he always displayed loving compassion for the weak. The high order of his intellect was obvious to all who knew him, but he was also, I like this, somewhat impractical, and he found the rougher elements of human life difficult to bear. He was described as scrupulous, fair, and conscientious. And like a good Jesuit, he cared about his students. If he found the Dublin experience tough, it was partly at least because he suffered from, quotation from the obituary, a great repugnance to the labour and responsibility involved in the preparation of the examination papers and in subsequently correcting and awarding them marks. I think we can forgive him for that. Now, Hopkins studied, of course, at Heythrop College's earlier incarnation, which I shall pronounce as St Beuno's, quite correctly, about which he wrote to his father with the sardonic comment, it's not up there now, like Lancing College done worse. He knew a thing or two about architecture. He clearly loved Wales, and even if the form of the study was pretty dull, he found plenty of intellectual and aesthetic stimulus. He was entranced by the landscape and the Welsh language. And there, in the middle of his theology studies, he returned, of course, to writing poetry. And at the suggestion of the then rector, in 1876, he produced the Wreck of the Deutschland, which was famously refused publication by the editor of the month, the Jesuit Literary and Theological Review. Because his work was never published until some 3 decades after his death, Hopkins has a reputation of being a private poet, always agonizing over whether the writing of poetry was compatible with his calling to Jesuit life and Christian ministry. But he clearly valued the Society's reputation as a body committed to humane values, and he believed in the significance, the importance of his writing. Hopkins the poet and Hopkins the priest coexisted with some difficulty, but that isn't to say that he was forced by his vows to resolve the competing claims of religion and literature in favour of the former. In a remarkable new study, a young academic, Martin Dubois, argues convincingly, to this ignoramus at any rate, against a tendency to impose some unified intellectual project on Hopkins' writing. He says this view of Hopkins, the seamless unity that he managed to construct somehow, is weighted towards the early phase of his poetic maturity and misses his concern with how matters of belief are received in time and combine with individual history. I'm emphasizing those 2 little phrases because I think they're important to what I'm trying to do. Are received in time and combine with individual history. A different sense of Hopkins emerges, says Dubois, from consideration of how his poetry grapples with faith as it is lived out in personal experience. Now, Dubois' point is that there is no single way into Hopkins' poetry, still less any comprehensive viewpoint which renders his work as a whole accessible to analysis. Instead, he commends attention to Hopkins' religious experience, a wonderfully ill-defined term, of course, but maybe that's the point. It includes both those special moments of heightened awareness and a more holistic sensitivity to the sheer ordinariness of the everyday, and no doubt a rich spectrum of points in between. To go back to what I was saying about the spiritual exercises, Ignatius begins not with a generic Christian who is to be chastened by intense ascetical exercise and taken to God, but with the grace from God that is already at work in the life of this individual here and now. The aim is to tell the gospel story in such a way that one comes alive to a sense of being called, of encountering a force that has to be acknowledged. Now, I'll return to Hopkins at the end. Take him for the moment as another of the Heythrop saints. You and I lack his extraordinary genius, but we share a legacy of learning rooted in the Ignatian humanist tradition. Whatever else is to be said about Ignatian spirituality, The fundamental aim is to help people find God or to be found by God. Thus it can be said to build a deeper and explicitly Christian response to the Word of God and to enhance those other accounts of the human good that permeate a diverse and plural society. Note well in that sentence the Catholic "and" that John McDade used to quote from Barth endlessly. Sometimes I wondered whether it was Barth quoting John McDade. That's what it felt like at times. The breadth and generosity of this vision is what we need to ponder further if we are to treasure and, yes, lament what has been lost from this place. John McDade used to introduce the new graduates to the Vice-Chancellor every year at the presentation ceremony with a grand rhetorical flourish. You have to remember that the VC in those days, Graham Zellick, was Jewish. And John used to say, I don't dare do the Scottish accent or I'll really get myself into trouble. Vice-Chancellor, never since Moses came down the mountain have so many been so learned in so much ancient wisdom. There's a bit more to it than that. When I was listening to the contributions earlier, the original cut of those compilations of Heythrop memories, I was struck by how often people talked in different ways about collegiality, the collective, as a distinctive mark of their time here. That's undoubtedly true of the academic staff, the sense of mutual support, genuine interest in each other's concerns, care for the ideals that sustain the place. All that has been quite remarkable. But it's also true of the wider college, our governors, our students, our alumni, and a wonderful group of administrators who have served this place selflessly over the years. Academic and administrative staff do different things. There can often be a great gulf set between them. But as Gwen mentioned the other day, Heythrop has avoided that division. For those who like me, go back a few years, who can forget senior common room parties where suddenly, as the evening got more and more relaxed, Phil Lineker, then secretary of pretty well everything, twinkle on the piano, and you get this wonderful Welsh soprano lilting out bits of Verdi and Wagner. Unforgettable. More recently, we've relied on Marian Jakob, Carolina Wilhelm Brown, Larry Markey and Vicky Rowley in the library, mighty ones, in more senses than one, Nadim and Tony Corley. So many more. In what other college, I ask myself, could a PhD student morph into an administrator, thence into lecturing, and end up as a much-loved head of department, as Anna Arbram did? The answer is a college that has been fortunate to have its corporate memory kept by the likes of Annabel Clarkson, without whom this conference could never have happened. At this point, let me make a personal confession. I did not begin to appreciate what we had at Heythrop College until we were in serious danger of losing it. When I returned from what I called my geriatric PhD in Cambridge, it's about 20 years ago, considerably more geriatric now, Heythrop began to go through a process of what was called normalization, entering into all the processes, wonderful things, auditing, compliance, and accountability that had hit the increasingly market-driven higher education world some years earlier. And for a small college, with its limited administrative structures, a culture of laissez-faire, goodwill, well, this was a bit of a shock. And life began to be ruled by acronyms. The REF, research exercise framework, NSS, student surveys, and the most blood-curdlingly horrific QA, quality assurance. I remember the day when the admirable John Luce, head of teaching and learning, introduced us to another obscure bit of jargon, levelization. My colleagues will remember that. Ensuring that there was a proper scrutiny of levels in the 3 years of undergraduate study. We all took it in, and then to my horror, after months of habituation, I even started using the jargon myself. But, and this is the serious point, it turned out that we were rather good at it. Heythrop College rose to the challenge. We came through the QA inspections with some success. Student satisfaction data were consistently high. Above all, the REF of 2014 showed that the standard of our research was excellent, particularly with regard to what was called environment, the structure put in place to ensure support for research, and impact, which at the time nobody knew anything about. But we were rather good at it, an assessment of how research contributes to wider society. I was talking to one of the lead assessors of that exercise some years ago, now, only a few weeks back, and he reminded me how impressive that last element had been. Heythrop not only claimed to be preparing people to reflect seriously on the interface between religious traditions and lived experience, we actually had the examples to prove it. Now for a grumpy bit. With the benefit of hindsight, it's desolating, to use an Ignatian term, to realize that at the same time the college was tasting real success, negotiations were beginning that would ultimately lead to closure. Perhaps the most positive experience I had of Heythrop College, what will stay long in the memory, is the process, Michael Lacewing drew attention to it in the little film, process that brought the entire teaching staff together to work on a new undergraduate curriculum. We all contributed our ideas, and 3 of the contemporary Heythrop saints, Wen, Michael Lacewing, John Luce, produced an integrated plan for delivering our 2 major subjects. The new curriculum picked up on our individual strengths and structured new conversations with and between subject areas. There was extraordinary energy behind the Curriculum 15 project. It felt like the very best of Heythrop College, and it caught the imagination. And even at the low point of the non-meeting of minds at St Mary's, Eddie will remember what I'm talking about, in the middle of those ill-fated negotiations, when I put the smart, glossy brochure on the table and they looked at it, it made an immediate impact. Ah, so this is what you do. Well, of course we didn't. Whatever else may have caused Heythrop to close, it wasn't for lack of philosophical and theological creativity. Would Curriculum 15 have raised the student numbers? Would it have saved the college? Well, we were never given the chance to find out. In the tough and competitive higher education environment, there was certainly no guarantee of success, but equally, there was nothing inevitable about closure. I'm convinced of that. I call to mind what Catherine Powell, another Heythrop saint, the doyenne of all QA administrators. Catherine said to me when I was myself planning a new initiative, Michael, this is not a failing institution. Academically, this is a successful institution. Now, I'll come back to that point later. For a moment, however, I'd like briefly to expand on the intellectual achievement of the college, to remind us all of some of those embers that need to be fanned back into life. Firstly, what I consider the most significant feature of the college throughout its time in London, and particularly in the last decade of its life, our major USP, unique selling point. At some point, someone had the bright idea of calling Heythrop the Specialist College of Philosophy and Theology in the University of London. Brendan, was that you? It was? No.
I don't think it was me.
Well, it's now you, okay. Anyway, dead right. Dead right. While the gap between the disciplines of philosophy and theology has grown in many parts of the academic world, Heythrop has managed to retain a broader view of its specialist subjects and of their potential to provide a distinctive experience of learning for students and fruitful collaboration too for teachers. In short, we talk to each other. I have to say I'm glad I don't have to do analytic philosophy like Michael Lacewing, but I'm also pleased that there are people who do, and that sometimes I even understand what they're on about. It makes me more careful about the language I use when I'm entering into the intricacies of interreligious relations. That's one point. Secondly, it's worth noting that the college's royal charter empowers the college specifically to promote theology and allied sciences. Philosophy has been the most important dialogue partner because philosophy has always been at the heart of the Catholic tradition. But it's worth remembering that the Bible in itself does not provide some analytic framework or blueprint for living, a message from on high. The scriptures have to be read as the record of a people of faith, a community who are trying to make sense of what has happened to them. And to read intelligently means attending to history, to culture, to psychology, to sociology, and, if I might make so bold, what other communities are saying about similar questions and themes. If there is one thing that has held our 6 centres and institutes together, it is dialogue, or as I prefer to put it, conversation. Committed, respectful, thoughtful conversation across intellectual boundaries, the sort of thing that Michael Kirwan has encouraged through the Heythrop Institute for Religion and Society, or Fiona Ellis in her extraordinarily influential Centre for the Philosophy of Religion. Thirdly, lest the use of that past tense should overwhelm our reflections, let me summarise very briefly 3 major points taken from the research strategy that followed the 2014 success. This is what struck us as important then, and it remains so now. I'm just going to put them on the board. I'm not going to read them. I want you to read them. Just pause for a few moments and just read what it was in 2014 that we thought was going to be important for the future. The power of ancient wisdom and contemporary encounter, the power of creative innovation and engagement, the power of vision and the common good. Trying to summarize something of what's there in those embers, which are only going to take a little bit of blowing to turn themselves into something really powerful. Over the years, Heythrop has been particularly effective at maintaining the rigorous scholarly attitude essential for reading ancient traditions and the carefully discerning critique appropriate to engaging with our everyday experience, the experience of society. If there is a key to Heythrop, if there is a way of reading the mystery as it is refracted through our nearly 50 years in the University of London, it lies not with some neat way of resolving the tension between tradition and experience, but with the honest and unremitting commitment to life in what Gillian Rose calls the broken middle, the middle of our everyday experience that is always broken and always in need of mending. It would be easy to get all romantic about Heythrop, to indulge our memories as mere nostalgia. But let's not underestimate at the same time the effect we have had on so many people through lectures and seminars and personal contact. All of us Heythrop alumni have imbibed a vast amount of stuff from each other. We have become skilled in everything from nuanced objections to the ontological argument to informed commentary on the pastoral fruits of the Vatican Council. But beyond the proliferation of learning outcomes and transferable skills, we've all found something more important. If you followed what Brendan was saying, it's what makes the university more than a multiversity dominated by the commodification of knowledge. It's about a learning that is genuinely transformative of the self. As we begin to write Heythrop's obituary, we seek to tell the truth. Already a variety of terms are being used to describe what has happened, each freighted with their own measure of emotion. Debauch is what I use. Scandal, tragedy, disaster. I find it extraordinary that the governing body meeting which received the Jesuit provincial's decision not to support the plan to go to Roehampton, it was the same day as the Brexit vote. Was the populist backlash against experts and elites beginning to infect the academy and the church? Sober analyses draw attention to underlying factors: the commercializing of higher education, the decline of religious orders, the marginalizing of theology in the public arena, intra-ecclesiastical rivalries and lack of leadership. The less sober point to more human failures: lack of will and imagination, dishonesty and incompetence. No doubt all have played a part, and with the benefit of hindsight, we may see a bigger picture. It's never that easy to read the signs of the times. And at the moment, like Hopkins's anonymous obituarist, we're left with affectionate memories of a life tragically cut short. Now, in drawing these reflections to a close, I want to refer to an obituary I myself wrote for another Heythrop saint, Joe Lashley, whose sister Anne is with us. Anne. Gwen has already spoken of Joe, but again, a little repetition does no harm. He died a few days after the decision to close. That decision became public. He never recovered from a heart attack. I'm glad it happened like that, because the news of closure would have hurt him deeply. For me, for his many students and colleagues, Joe stands for everything that is best about Heythrop. I don't just mean his personal qualities. He was gentle and kindly. He was a great listener. He was astute. He was precise. Nor do I refer to the esteem in which he was held as teacher, as mentor, and research supervisor. He had an unerring ability to put his finger on what was wrong and to get animated about what was right. I think of him as a scholar, a learned man who knew how to apply big ideas across a range of concerns and questions. He never taught me, but as a very junior lecturer, I found him always a source of encouragement in anything that I proposed to do. And when I was appointed Dean of Research Students, Joe, then retired, was the first person I went to for advice. There was, of course, as I knew, no magic formula to supervision. But he told me about his own doctoral research on the baptismal homilies of Cyril of Jerusalem. The conventional wisdom, he said, was that Cyril was either a simple Platonist or a muddle-headed pastor. Now, Joe had a slightly truculent side, and he wasn't given to observing conventions. Maybe Cyril was neither, or an interesting combination of the two. What was important to Joe was the discipline that sets essentialist either-or thinking to one side in favour of a more generous both-and way of holding polarities and indeed interpersonal relations together. This lack of formula remained a principle of theological practice that applied equally well to his original interest in sacramental theology as it did to what became increasingly important for him: pastoral theology, liberation theologies of all kinds, and theological anthropology in an increasingly contentious postmodern age. His teaching owed its success to his consistent refusal to allow easy resolutions to complex ideas. At the same time, he insisted on rooting all theological language in ritual and in prayer. To the suggestion of a more literalist colleague that such and such is a mere symbol, Joe testily replied, I can hear his voice now, there's never any such thing as a mere symbol. Joe wrote very little. That wasn't his particular forte. But what he did write carries the authority of experience. In the preface to a Festschrift for his 65th birthday, he wrote, theologically, the process begins with listening, with becoming aware, through a myriad of mediations, of that which makes all conversation possible, of the ground of being and granite of it, who always speaks first. Ground of being and granite of it. The quotation, of course, is from the Wreck of the Deutschland. Hopkins is marveling at the majesty of the God of tides and oceans. Human beings may, as he ruefully admits, have allowed themselves to slide into a sense of disenchantment and forgetfulness. Yet the grandeur of God never loses its power to shock and overwhelm. I find something intensely moving in that name etched on the Jesuit tombstone. There is, of course, a continuity between that one name among the many, not even his full name, in a rather dull Dublin cemetery, and the immortal diamond memorialized among the great and the good in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Theologians, scholars, and lovers of literature alike will go on teasing out the enigmatic relationship between Hopkins' aesthetic sensibility, his philosophical training, his theological commitment. That's what we do. And it matters that we go on doing it, reading the mystery, seeking out truth, even if, especially if, we know that the only resolution lies in God. No more than Hopkins' anonymous obituarist do we who mourn the end of Heythrop have the privilege of hindsight. Maybe in another 30 years it will be clearer what happened and why. And maybe there will be a Robert Bridges around to pick up the fragments, to fan the embers, and bring something to birth that at this moment we can hardly imagine. If I draw to a conclusion at this point, it's not because I have any consoling overview or message that we can take away and cherish in those long Heythropless nights. What I would say is this: Heythrop did not fail. An amazing number of people worked their butts off to find a viable way forward, and we can be proud of what we did, which is not to say that the closure of this extraordinary institution is anything but a disaster for the Church in this country, and a terrible loss for the all too delicate ecology of humane learning in philosophy and theology that we stand for. Two final thoughts. The first, by happy chance, is from Joe Lachley, Cyril of Jerusalem, whose instruction to catechumens forms the office of readings for today. The reading finishes, if you are holding anything against anyone, forget it, let it go. The magnanimity of forgiveness is a grace. It doesn't come easily. Maybe these few days can begin a process of healing, though I suspect Michael Lacewing would argue that forgiveness and truthfulness hang together in quite complex ways. And maybe to get there, we can listen once again, finally, to our poet laureate. The last sonnet Hopkins wrote, a few months before his untimely death, bears a Latin title from the Vulgate, Justus quidem tues Domine. It puts us in touch with a tradition that goes back to the psalmist and one of the most profound of all literary forms, the lament for what has been lost. It's a sad but defiant poem, poignant and moving in its sense of helplessness. But it ends, as do all the best of rabbinic texts, with an understated, tentative note of hope which puts all things back into the tender mercy of God. Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But, sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavour end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat, thwart me? O the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I that spend, sir, life upon thy cause. See banks and brakes now leaved, how thick, laced they are again with fretty chervil. Look, and fresh wind shakes them. Birds build, but not I build, no, but strain time's eunuch, and not breed one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. Thank you.